My mother can't keep living alone in that big house. My daughter-in-law whispered to my son in the kitchen. If she really loved this family, she'd sign the house over and move into assisted living before something happens. I stood frozen in the hallway, my hand still resting against the wall for balance. Then I heard my son answers. You're probably right. I didn't cry. I didn't walk into the kitchen and confront them. I simply turned around and went back upstairs to my bedroom. But later that night, after everyone had gone to sleep, I opened the old cedar chest at the foot of my bed and took out the folder my husband told me never to forget. What happened after that changed everything. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end and let me know where you're watching from. Sometimes the people who smile at you across the dinner table are already planning what to do with your life. Once they decide you've become inconvenient. The strange thing is, the evening had started so normally. Rain tapped softly against the kitchen windows, while I stirred a pot of chicken soup on the stove. October in Ohio always carried that damp chill that settled into old bones faster than it used to. The house smelled like rosemary, garlic, and the cornbread I'd pulled from the oven 20 minutes earlier. For 43 years, this kitchen had been the heart of my home. Frank built the shelves above the sink himself the summer Nathan turned 6. I could still picture him standing on a ladder with a pencil tucked behind his ear while little Nathan handed him nails from a coffee can. Back then, this house was full of noise. Baseball cleats by the back door. School projects spread across the dining table. Christmas music playing too loud every December because Frank insisted holidays should sound joyful. Now the silence seemed louder than any noise ever had. Frank had been gone for 11 months. Some mornings I still reached for his side of the bed before remembering there was no one there anymore. At 73, grief changes shape. It doesn't scream all the time. Sometimes it just sits quietly beside you while you drink your coffee alone. Nathan and his wife Tricia had started visiting more often after the funeral. At first, I thought it came from concern. They brought groceries, helped mow the lawn. Tricia even insisted on organizing my medication into one of those plastic weekly containers. You shouldn't be handling everything by yourself anymore, Gloria, she'd say, with that polished smile she wore around other people. I wanted to believe her kindness was genuine. But little things began to feel off. Conversations stopped when I entered a room. Tricia suddenly became very interested in bills, insurance papers, and property taxes. She asked questions about the mortgage, even though Frank and I had paid off this house nearly 20 years ago. One afternoon, I caught her taking pictures of the backyard. Oh, the flowers looked pretty, she explained quickly. But she hadn't taken pictures of the flowers. She'd photographed the entire property line. I told myself not to be paranoid. Losing Frank had left me emotional, sensitive maybe. Nathan was my son, the boy who used to run into my arms after Little League games, the teenager who cried when his dog died at 16. I raised him to be kind. At least I thought I did. That evening, Tricia set the table while Nathan sat in the living room pretending to watch football. He barely looked up from his phone when I carried in the soup. You don't have to cook every time we come over, Mom, he muttered. I like cooking, I said softly. Tricia smiled without looking at me. Well, eventually, we'll need to simplify things around here. The comment floated in the air strangely. I glanced toward her. What do you mean? Oh, nothing, she said quickly. I just mean houses like this become a lot for people at a certain age. People at a certain age. Not you. Not Gloria. Just old people in general. I suddenly noticed how often she'd started using phrases like that. As we ate dinner, Tricia talked about a beautiful assisted living community 20 minutes outside town. According to her, it had yoga classes, a movie theater, and adorable little cottages. It's not like those depressing nursing homes anymore, she said, while buttering her cornbread. These places are basically luxury resorts. Nathan kept his eyes on his plate. I felt something cold settle into my stomach. I'm perfectly happy here, I replied calmly. Of course, Tricia said too quickly. Nobody's saying otherwise. But her eyes slid briefly toward Nathan. A look passed between them. Small, silent, practiced. That was when I excused myself and walked upstairs early, pretending I had a headache. But halfway down the hallway, I realized I'd forgotten my glasses on the kitchen counter. So I came back quietly, and that was when I heard Tricia's voice drifting from the kitchen. She's getting more forgetful, Nathan. Honestly, it's becoming irresponsible to leave her alone in this house. Then came the sentence that hollowed something inside my chest. If she signs the property over now, we can avoid a huge mess later. Silence followed, long enough for me to pray my son would shut it down immediately. Instead, Nathan sighed heavily. You're probably right. I didn't sleep that night. The rain kept falling against the bedroom windows in slow, uneven taps, and every sound inside the house seemed sharper than usual. The refrigerator humming downstairs, the old pipes knocking softly in the walls, the grandfather clock in the hallway, marking every passing minute, like it was reminding me that something fundamental had changed. Nathan thought I was asleep. Tricia probably thought I was confused, but I heard every word. At around 2 in the morning, I finally got out of bed and wrapped Frank's old cardigan around my shoulders. The house felt colder lately, though maybe that was just what grief did to a person. It hollowed things out from the inside until even familiar rooms stopped feeling warm. I walked slowly downstairs and stood in the living room for a long moment. The lamp beside Frank's recliner still cast the same soft amber glow it always had. I hadn't changed much since he passed. His reading glasses still rested on the side table, beside yesterday's newspaper. His favorite leather chair still faced the television, exactly the way he left it the night before his heart attack. People kept telling me I needed to move forward. But nobody ever explained what that really meant. Did moving forward mean pretending 46 years of marriage could be packed into cardboard boxes and donated to strangers? Did it mean smiling politely while your own family discussed your future? Like you were an aging appliance they no longer had room for. I sat down carefully on the sofa and stared toward the dark kitchen, assisted living. The words sounded harmless when Tricia said them. Gentle, even. That was her talent. She wrapped ugly intentions inside polite language until people almost felt guilty for questioning her. I thought back over the past few months, and suddenly things that once seemed small began fitting together differently. The missing mail. The day Nathan insisted on driving me to my doctor's appointment, even though I'd driven myself there for years. The time Tricia casually asked whether Frank had ever updated the deed before he died. At the time, I answered without suspicion. Now every conversation replayed in my head with a different meaning. I closed my eyes and leaned back against the couch. Frank had always seen people more clearly than I did. About 10 years ago, after one particularly tense Thanksgiving dinner, he'd stood beside me in this exact living room while Tricia loaded leftovers into plastic containers in the kitchen. She's ambitious, he said quietly. I remember laughing softly. That's not necessarily a bad thing. No, Frank replied, but ambitious people sometimes mistake kindness for weakness. At the time, I thought he was being unfair. Now I wondered if he'd understood something long before I did. The next morning, sunlight crept weakly through the kitchen curtains while I made coffee. My hands felt steady again, which surprised me. I expected anger, tears, panic. Instead, I felt strangely calm, not because I wasn't hurt, because some part of me had finally stopped doubting what I already knew. Nathan and Tricia arrived around 10 carrying grocery bags and forced smiles. Tricia kissed my cheek like nothing had happened. You should have called us if you needed anything, she said brightly. We worry about you alone in this big house. I poured coffee into 3 mugs without answering right away. Nathan looked exhausted. Dark circles hung beneath his eyes, and he kept rubbing the back of his neck the way he used to when he was nervous as a teenager. Guilt was eating at him, but guilt and courage are 2 different things. I was thinking, Tricia began carefully, setting down a bag of apples on the counter. Maybe we should start looking at a few places, just casually. I stirred cream into my coffee. What places? You know, she said lightly. Communities for seniors. Somewhere safer. Somewhere with people around. Safer. There was that word again, as if I were one slippery bathroom floor away from disaster. Nathan finally spoke. Mom, nobody's forcing you into anything. But he wouldn't meet my eyes when he said it. That hurt more than Tricia's manipulation ever could. I looked at my son for a long moment, and suddenly remembered the winter he caught pneumonia at age 8. I stayed awake, 3 nights beside his bed, checking his temperature every hour, because I was terrified something would happen to him while he slept. Back then, protecting him felt as natural as breathing. Now I realized motherhood doesn't end when children grow older. Sometimes it simply becomes heartbreak in quieter forms. I'm doing just fine here, I said calmly. Tricia smiled again, though this one looked tighter around the edges. Of course you are, she replied. We're just trying to think ahead. Think ahead. That was what people called it when they wanted something that belonged to someone else. And for the first time since Frank died, I began to understand something clearly. This wasn't really about my safety. It was about my house. That afternoon, after Nathan and Tricia left, I stood at the kitchen sink watching their SUV disappear down the street. The moment the car turned the corner, the smile vanished from my face. The neighborhood looked exactly the same as it always had. Maple trees lining the sidewalks. Halloween decorations beginning to appear on front porches. Mrs. Delaney across the street walking her little terrier in a red sweater, despite the dog clearly hating it. Normal. That was the strange thing about betrayal. The world kept looking ordinary, while your entire understanding of your own life quietly shifted underneath you. I rinsed the coffee mug some slowly and tried to steady my thoughts. Maybe they were genuinely worried. Maybe I was overreacting. But deep down, I already knew that wasn't true. You don't whisper about transferring property if your only concern is someone's health. That evening, I decided to go through the mail myself before Tricia could organize it the next time she visited. At first, everything looked ordinary. Utility bills, grocery coupons, a church newsletter. Then I found a white envelope wedged beneath a catalog. The return address belonged to a real estate office in Columbus. My stomach tightened. Inside was a brochure filled with glossy photographs of renovated kitchens and bright living rooms. Across the front, someone had circled a sentence in blue ink. Now is the perfect time to maximize your property value. At the bottom of the page was a handwritten note. Call me when she's ready, no signature, but I recognized Tricia's handwriting immediately. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table. For a long moment, I simply stared at the paper, while the clock ticked softly above the refrigerator. The humiliation hit harder than the anger. She wasn't discussing possibilities anymore. She was making plans. And somehow, the worst part wasn't even Tricia. It was Nathan. Because none of this could happen without my son allowing it. I folded the brochure carefully and slipped it back into the envelope just as my phone rang. It was Janice Holloway, my next-door neighbor. You all right over there? She asked immediately. Janice had lived beside us for nearly 30 years. She was the kind of woman who noticed everything without seeming nosy about it. I'm fine, I answered automatically. There was a pause. Honey, she said gently, I saw that realtor walking around your backyard yesterday. My fingers tightened around the phone. What realtor?
The blonde woman with the clipboard.
She was out there with Tricia for almost 20 minutes. I closed my eyes briefly, so it hadn't been my imagination. Janice lowered her voice slightly. I didn't want to interfere, but something about it felt off. I looked around the kitchen. Frank's old coffee mug still sat beside the sink from that morning. The curtains moved faintly from the heater kicking on. Every inch of this room held pieces of my life. And somewhere along the way, my own family had started treating it like inventory. Thank you for telling me, I said quietly. After we hung up, I walked through the house slowly. The dining room still smelled faintly, like lemon polish from the weekends. Frank used to wax the furniture himself. Upstairs, the hallway creaked beneath my slippers exactly the way it had for decades. I paused outside Nathan's old bedroom and pushed the door open. Most of his childhood things were gone now, but a few pieces remained. A baseball trophy, an old Browns poster curling at the corners, the wooden bookshelf Frank built with his own hands. I rested my fingers lightly against it and felt tears finally threaten to rise. Not because of the house. Because I suddenly understood how easy it had become for Nathan to separate memories from value. To him, this place was now an asset. To me, it was a lifetime. Downstairs, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was Tricia. "Hi, Gloria," she said cheerfully the moment I answered. Nathan and I were thinking maybe we could stop by tomorrow with someone who specializes in senior transitions. Senior transitions. Another polished phrase. Another soft disguise for something cold. I don't think that's necessary, I replied evenly. Oh, it's just informational, she insisted. No pressure at all. We're only trying to help. Help. Funny how that word kept appearing every time someone wanted control over my future. I glanced toward the living room window, where the porch light had just flickered on automatically as dusk settled outside. Frank installed those lights after I slipped on the front steps one winter. He spent an entire Saturday out in the cold, making sure I'd always feel safe coming home. Safe. That word used to mean love. Now it sounded like manipulation. I'm tired tonight, I told her calmly. We'll talk another time. Before she could argue, I hung up. Then I walked upstairs to the bedroom and opened the cedar chest again. The folder Frank left me was still exactly where I remembered. And for the first time since his funeral, I finally decided to look inside. The cedar chest smelled like lavender and old wood when I lifted the lid. Frank used to joke that the thing weighed more than our first car. We bought it at an estate sale during our second year of marriage, back when we could barely afford groceries, after paying rent. Over the years, it became the place we stored everything too meaningful to throw away. Photo albums, Christmas ornaments, letters, and apparently, secrets. The folder rested beneath an old quilt Frank's mother made sometime in the 1950s. My hands hesitated before touching it. For nearly a year after Frank died, I couldn't bring myself to open anything connected to his paperwork unless absolutely necessary. Every signature felt too final. Every document carried the unbearable reminder that the man who spent 46 years beside me now existed only through records and memories. But tonight felt different. Tonight I needed answers. I carried the folder downstairs and sat at the dining room table. The same table where Nathan used to do homework while Frank pretended to help, despite barely understanding 8th grade math himself. The lamp overhead cast a soft circle of light across the papers as I opened the file carefully. Inside were several documents organized in Frank's neat handwriting. Insurance papers, bank information, property records, and beneath them all, an envelope with my name written across the front. Gloria, just that. No fancy message. No dramatic goodbye. My throat tightened anyway. I opened the envelope slowly and unfolded the letter inside. If you're reading this, Frank wrote, then I'm probably gone. And knowing you waited longer than you should have before looking through this folder. A shaky laugh escaped me despite everything. That sounded exactly like him. Outside, wind rattled softly against the windows while I kept reading. I know you think people are naturally good. That's one of the things I loved most about you. But sometimes grief changes families. Sometimes money does too. My eyes moved slower after that. I need you to promise me something. Don't let guilt pressure you into giving away the house. I stopped breathing for a second. The silence inside the dining room suddenly felt enormous. Frank continued. Nathan has a good heart, but he avoids conflict. And Tricia. The sentence paused there, as though he'd carefully considered how much to say. Tricia cares too much about appearances and security. That combination worries me. I leaned back in my chair slowly. Even now, Frank was trying to be fair. Trying not to sound cruel about the woman who might already have been planning my removal from the home he built for us. At the bottom of the letter, another paragraph had been underlined twice. The house is protected, Gloria. Arthur Bellamy knows everything. If anyone pressures you after I'm gone, call him before making any decisions. Arthur Bellamy, Frank's attorney. I hadn't spoken to Arthur since the funeral. At the time, I couldn't handle another conversation about legal paperwork and death certificates. I just wanted the world to stop moving for a little while. Now I understood why, Frank insisted. I remember his name. My gaze drifted toward the living room. This house had never been luxurious. The cabinets were older. The hardwood floors creaked. The upstairs bathroom still had the pale blue tiles. Frank always promised he'd replace someday, but every corner held history. I remembered painting the nursery pale yellow before Nathan was born, because we couldn't afford to repaint twice after, finding out the gender. I remembered Frank carrying our sleeping son upstairs after Little League games. I remembered Christmas mornings when wrapping paper covered the entire floor before sunrise. A life had happened here, not just ownership. And suddenly, I felt angry at myself for almost letting Tricia convince me. This home was simply too much house for an old woman. The problem wasn't the house. The problem was that somebody else wanted it. My phone buzzed against the table, startling me. Nathan. I stared at his name for several seconds before answering. "Hey, Mom," he said carefully. "You sounded upset earlier." Upset. Such a small word for betrayal. "I'm fine," I replied. There was a pause on the line. Then he sighed quietly. "Tricia's just trying to help. You know that, right?" I closed my eyes. Even now, he needed me to make this easier for him, to reassure him, to protect him from the discomfort of what he was allowing to happen. "I'm tired tonight, Nathan." "She found a really nice assisted living place," he continued quickly. "Honestly, Mom, some of them are nicer than regular neighborhoods now." I looked down at Frank's letter still lying open beside me. For the first time, I heard something beneath my son's words. Pressure, not concern. And that realization hurt more than anything Tricia had done so far. "Did you already visit these places?" I asked quietly. Nathan hesitated just a fraction too long. Yes, the answer settled coldly inside my chest. They hadn't just discussed my future. They'd already started planning it. The next morning, I called Arthur Bellamy. My hand hovered over the phone for nearly a full minute before I finally dialed the number written at the bottom of Frank's letter. Part of me still hoped I was misunderstanding everything. That Arthur would laugh gently and tell me Frank had only been overly cautious. But deep down, I already knew better. Arthur answered on the third ring. "Bellamy and Associates." "This is Gloria Hensley," I said quietly. Frank Hensley's wife. There was a brief pause before his tone softened immediately. "Mrs. Hensley, I've been hoping you'd call eventually." Something about those words made my stomach tighten. He'd been expecting this, Arthur suggested. "We meet in person later that afternoon." The drive into town felt strange. Trees along the road had turned deep shades of orange and gold, and for a moment I remembered how much Frank loved October drives. Every fall, he insisted on taking the long route home, just to admire the leaves. Funny how grief sneaks into ordinary moments. Arthur's office sat above an old pharmacy downtown, the same building it had occupied for over 30 years. Walking inside felt like stepping backward in time. Dark wooden shelves, leather chairs, the faint smell of coffee and paper. Arthur himself looked older than I remembered. More gray hair, reading glasses balanced lower on his nose, but his eyes remained sharp. After we sat down, he folded his hands carefully across the desk. "How much has your son told you?" he asked gently. "Not your family, your son." "Not much," I admitted, but I overheard enough. Arthur nodded slowly, as though confirming something to himself. Then he opened a thick file drawer beside his desk and pulled out several folders. "Frank came to see me 6 months before his heart attack," he said. He was worried. The room suddenly felt colder. "About what?" Arthur hesitated carefully. He believed there was growing financial pressure inside Nathan's household. I stared at him. "Nathan never said anything. That's usually how debt works," Arthur replied quietly. He slid a document across the desk toward me. Credit reports, loan summaries, late payment notices. I looked down at the numbers and felt my chest tighten. Credit card debt. A second mortgage on Nathan's home. Business loans. Some of the balances were staggering. "I don't understand," I whispered. "Nathan has a good job." "He does," Arthur agreed. "But according to Frank, Tricia became very focused on appearances over the last few years. Expensive vacations, renovations, private schools, new vehicles every other year." As he spoke, images flashed through my mind. Tricia arriving at Thanksgiving in designer boots, the luxury SUV, the kitchen remodel she proudly showed off last Christmas. All those little things I ignored, because I assumed successful people simply lived differently than I did. Arthur leaned back slightly. Frank became concerned when Tricia started asking questions about the property. I looked up sharply. "What kind of questions?" She wanted to know how the deed was structured, whether the house could bypass probate, whether ownership could transfer quickly. If something happened to you. The humiliation burned hotter this time. Because strangers were discussing my home, because they'd been planning around my death while smiling across my dinner table. Arthur removed another document from the folder. "That's why Frank created the trust." I stared down at the paperwork. The house had been legally protected months before Frank died. Ownership could not be transferred without multiple legal safeguards, including direct approval from independent counsel. In other words, Frank saw this coming. "He knew they might pressure me," I said softly. Arthur's expression remained careful. I think Frank hoped he was wrong. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Outside the office window, I could hear faint traffic moving through downtown. Somewhere nearby, a church bell rang noon. Normal sounds. Normal life continuing while mine quietly unraveled. Then Arthur looked at me directly. "Mrs. Hensley, there's something else you should know." My fingers tightened around the edge of the papers. "Tricia contacted a realtor 3 weeks ago." I felt physically still. "She asked for an estimated mark value of your property." The room blurred slightly around the edges. 3 weeks ago, before they ever mentioned assisted living to me. Before the fake concern. Before the brochures and careful conversations. This had never been about helping me adjust after losing Frank. It had started with the house from the very beginning. Arthur lowered his voice slightly. "And yesterday morning, someone from an assisted living facility called my office, asking whether you had cognitive, decline documentation on file." A cold silence settled over me. Cognitive decline. They were already building a case. Suddenly, every moment from the last few months rearranged itself inside my mind. The questions about my memory. Tricia correcting me unnecessarily in front of people. Nathan insisting on handling paperwork to make things easier. They weren't preparing for my future. They were preparing to take control of it. Arthur studied me carefully across the desk. You need to be very cautious now, Gloria. For the first time since Frank died, I finally understood something clearly. I wasn't grieving inside a loving family anymore. I was standing in the middle of something much colder. When I returned home from Arthur's office, the house no longer felt quiet. It felt watched. Every room carried a different meaning now. The hallway where Nathan took his first steps. The kitchen where Frank danced with me one Christmas Eve while snow fell outside the windows. The backyard where we buried our old golden retriever beneath the maple tree. For decades, this house had been the safest place I knew. Now I understood that someone else had already started imagining life here after I was gone. Or worse, after I was removed. I set my purse down, slows, on the dining room table, and looked around the room. Afternoon, sunlight stretched across the hardwood floors in long golden strips. Dust floated lazily through the air. Everything looked peaceful. That was what made betrayal so frightening sometimes. It rarely announced itself loudly at first. It arrived politely, carefully, smiling while offering to help. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a cup of coffee, even though my hands no longer wanted it. My mind kept replaying Arthur's words. Cognitive decline documentation. The phrase sounded clinical, harmless, but underneath it sat something terrifying. If they convinced enough people I wasn't capable of handling my own affairs, they could slowly take control of every decision left in my life. Where I lived, what I signed, what happened to my home. I sat at the kitchen table for nearly an hour thinking. Then finally, for the first time since Frank's funeral, I stopped reacting emotionally and started planning carefully. By evening, I had already made 3 decisions. First, I moved every important document out of the filing cabinet in the study. The deed, the trust paperwork, bank statements, insurance records. I placed them inside a locked storage box Frank once used for tax files and carried it upstairs to the bedroom closet. Second, I changed the passwords to my online banking accounts. The young man at the bank helped me reset everything while pretending not to notice my shaking hands. I hated how embarrassed I felt doing something so simple, as though protecting myself from my own family somehow reflected badly on me. Third, I stopped underestimating Tricia. That may have been the most important decision of all, because women like Tricia relied on people believing they were harmless. That evening around 7, my phone buzzed with a text message from her. Hope you're having a restful day. Egg Nathan and I found a beautiful community today. You'd absolutely love it there. Attached beneath the message was a photograph, a cheerful lobby with white furniture and smiling elderly people playing cards beside a fireplace. I stared at the image for a long moment. It looked less like a home and more like a brochure pretending to be one. A few seconds later, another message appeared. We're only thinking about your safety, Gloria. Safety again. I locked my phone without responding. About 20 minutes later, headlights swept across the front windows. Nathan's truck. I watched from the living room as he walked slowly up the driveway alone, shoulders tense beneath his jacket. For a brief second, he reminded me of the nervous teenage boy who used to confess broken rules before I even discovered them myself. When I opened the front door, cold October air rushed inside with him. Hey, Mom, he said quietly. You're here late. He nodded awkwardly. I just wanted to check on you. Check on me. Everything sounded different now. I stepped aside and let him in. He stood uncertainly in the living room while glancing around the house, almost studying it. That hurt more than I expected. I offered coffee out of habit, and he accepted automatically. Some parts of the hood survive even betrayal. For a while, we sat in silence at the kitchen table. Then Nathan cleared his throat. Tricia worries about you being alone here. I stirred cream into my coffee slowly. Does she? She means well. There it was again. The excuse he kept hiding behind. I finally looked directly at my son. When exactly did you start discussing assisted living? Nathan froze slightly. A few weeks ago. Not after concern. Not after some emergency. Weeks ago. Before they ever spoke to me. And the realtor? I asked calmly. The color drained from his face immediately. For a moment, he looked exactly like the little boy who once lied about breaking Frank's fishing rod. Mom, I'm asking a simple question. He rubbed both hands across his face heavily. We were only exploring options. Options. Such a clean word for betrayal. You planned to sell my house before even speaking to me about it. It's not like that. Then explain it to me. Nathan looked down at the table, and suddenly I realized something devastating. He wasn't protecting Tricia because he agreed with her completely. He was protecting the life they built together. The expensive cars, the debt, the appearances. Somewhere along the way, my son had become afraid of losing his lifestyle more than afraid of losing my trust. I didn't want things to get ugly, he whispered finally. Ugly. As though I were the difficult part of this situation. I leaned back slowly in my chair and studied the man I raised. Then I asked the question I'd been avoiding since all this began. Nathan, were you ever planning to let me stay here? The silence that followed told me everything before he even answered. Nathan never answered my question. He just sat there at my kitchen table, staring into his coffee, like a man, hoping silence could somehow soften the truth. And maybe that hurt more than if he had simply admitted everything outright. After a while, he stood up slowly. I should probably head home, he muttered. Home. Funny how that word sounded different now, too. I walked him to the front door out of habit. Mothers spend decades escorting their children safely into the world, even when those children eventually become strangers. Before stepping outside, Nathan hesitated. Mom, Tricia's organizing a family dinner on Sunday. I folded my arms lightly against the chill drifting through the doorway. What kind of dinner?
She just thinks,
Everyone, meaning they already discussed this together without me. I'll think about it, I replied. Nathan nodded, relieved I hadn't immediately refused. Then he left without hugging me. I stood on the porch long after his truck disappeared down the street. The cold air smelled faintly, like wood smoke and wet leaves. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked. Twice before the neighborhood settled. Frank used to say, you could measure the health of a family by small moments. Who calls first after an argument? Who notices when someone looks tired? Who stays when things become inconvenient? By that measure, something inside my family had been sick for a very long time. Sunday arrived gray and windy. I almost didn't go, but Arthur's warning kept replaying in my mind. Be cautious now, Gloria. People reveal themselves most clearly when they think they're close to winning. So at 5:30 that evening, I drove to Nathan and Tricia's house, carrying the pecan pie I'd promised to bring. The same pie. Nathan begged for every Thanksgiving since he was 12 years old. Some foolish part of motherhood still survived inside me, despite everything. Their house looked beautiful from the outside. Fresh landscaping, expensive outdoor lanterns glowing warmly beside the walkway. Tricia cared deeply about appearances, because appearances allowed people to mistake polish for character. The moment she opened the door, her smile appeared perfectly in place. Gloria, you look wonderful. I handed her the pie carefully. You didn't have to bring dessert, she said sweetly, but she still took it immediately. Inside, soft jazz played through hidden speakers while candles flickered across the dining room table. Everything felt carefully staged. Too perfect, like a hotel trying to imitate comfort. Nathan kissed my cheek awkwardly before returning to the wine glasses he'd been arranging, and sitting near the living room window was Avery. My granddaughter looked up from her phone and smiled genuinely the moment she saw me. Grandma, that one word nearly broke my heart. Because, unlike the adults in this room, Avery still sounded sincere. Dinner started pleasantly enough. Tricia talked about a charity event at the country club. Nathan discussed interest rates and business contracts. Avery quietly pushed vegetables around her plate, while occasionally glancing toward me with worried eyes. Then, halfway through dinner, Tricia finally steered the conversations where she wanted it. "We visited Willow Creek again yesterday," she said casually. I kept cutting my chickens slowly. "Willow Creek? The assisted living community," she explained brightly. "Honestly, Gloria, it's gorgeous. They even have art classes and a private fitness center." Nathan avoided looking at me. Avery's fork paused midair. "I'm not interested in moving," I replied calmly. Tricia smiled tighter. "Well, nobody's forcing you." But there it was again. That careful pressure hiding beneath polite words. Nathan cleared his throat nervously. "Mom, maybe it wouldn't hurt just to tour the place." I set my fork down gently. "And why exactly would I need assisted living?" Silence flickered briefly across the table. Then Tricia spoke in the same soothing tone people use with frightened children. "It's not about needing it now. It's about planning ahead responsibly." Responsible. Another weapon disguised as kindness. I glanced toward Avery. My granddaughter looked deeply uncomfortable now. Good. At least someone still understood this conversation wasn't normal. Tricia reached into her purse beside the chair and removed a glossy brochure. "I brought information in case you wanted to look." The brochure slid across the table toward me, like a contract. Elegant smiling seniors stared back from the cover, beneath large gold letters, promising comfort, security, peace of mind. I didn't touch it. "You've certainly done a lot of research," I said quietly. Nathan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Tricia laughed softly. "Well, these places fill up quickly." There it was. The truth almost slipping through. "Not concerned." Planning. Avery suddenly spoke for the first time in nearly 20 minutes. "Grandma likes her house." The room went still. Tricia's smile flickered for just a second before returning. "Of course she does, sweetheart. But eventually, people need more support." Avery looked directly at her mother. "She still drives better than Dad." Nathan nearly choked on his drink. For the first time all evening, I almost smiled. Tricia's expression hardened so briefly, most people wouldn't have noticed it. But I did. And in that tiny moment, I saw something beneath all her polished manners. Impatience. Because I wasn't cooperating quickly enough. Then she turned back toward me and said the sentence that changed everything. "We're only trying to protect the family's future, Gloria. Not your future. The family's future." And suddenly I understood exactly what role they believed I now played in this story. I barely touched the rest of my dinner after that. The conversation drifted into safer topics eventually. School schedules, grocery prices, a neighbor installing a new fence. But underneath every word sat something tense and invisible, like a crack spreading slowly beneath ice. Tricia kept refilling wine glasses no one really wanted. Nathan kept pretending everything was normal, and Avery kept watching all of us too carefully for an 18-year-old. By the time dessert arrived, I felt emotionally exhausted. Still, I stayed polite. That's the strange thing about women from my generation. We were raised to preserve peace, even while our hearts were breaking quietly inside our own kitchens. After coffee, Nathan walked me to my car, while Tricia stayed inside, cleaning dishes. The cold wind whipped across the driveway as he shoved his hands into his coat pockets. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Nathan sighed heavily. "She means well, Mom." I almost laughed. That sentence had become his shield against reality. "Do you even hear yourself anymore?" I asked softly. He looked tired. Older somehow. "Things are complicated right now. Financially?" His head snapped toward me immediately. There it was. Fear. Real fear this time. "Nathan," I continued quietly, "how bad is it?" He looked away toward the dark street. For several long seconds, the only sound between us was wind rattling dry leaves across the driveway. Then finally he spoke. The business slowed down last year. I stayed silent. Once people begin telling the truth, interruptions only make them retreat. Nathan rubbed both hands over his face. A few contracts fell through. Then interest rates went up. Credit cards got out of hand. Out of hand. Another soft phrase trying to make something ugly sound temporary. How much debt? I asked. His silence answered before the number did. Almost 400,000. The words hit me harder than I expected. Not because of the money itself. Because suddenly, everything made sense. The pressure. The realtor. The assisted living conversations. The fake concern wrapped around every interaction. They weren't simply planning ahead. They were drowning. And somewhere along the way, my house had started looking like a lifeboat. Nathan stared at the ground while speaking quietly. We thought maybe if you downsized. Downsized. Interesting how Greg always chooses gentle vocabulary. You mean if I sold the house? He swallowed hard. It would help everyone. Everyone. Except the woman losing her home. A painful memory suddenly surfaced in my mind. Nathan, at age 19, sitting beside Frank at this same kitchen table, promising he'd never forget the sacrifices we made to put him through college. Back then, he sounded so sincere, so grateful. Frank picked up extra shifts at the factory during those years. I worked weekends at the library. We skipped vacations. Delayed repairs around the house. And we did it gladly, because that's what parents do. Now our sacrifices had somehow transformed into assets waiting to be claimed. I would have helped you, I said quietly. Nathan looked up sharply. What? If you had simply come to me honestly. His expression cracked slightly then. Real shame finally breaking through. But shame after betrayal still leaves damage behind. We didn't know how to tell you, he admitted. No. Trisha knew exactly how to tell me. She simply chose manipulation instead of honesties because manipulation protected her control over the situation. And Nathan allowed it because facing debt felt easier than confronting his wife. I looked toward the warm glow shining through the front windows of their expensive home. The oversized SUV in the driveway, the renovated kitchen, all those appearances Arthur warned me about. How much of this was Tricia? I asked carefully. Nathan didn't answer immediately. That hesitation told me enough. Finally, he whispered, She just wanted security. Security. Funny how often that word appeared whenever someone tried justifying selfishness. Frank spent his entire life building security too, but his version looked different. Working overtime, fixing things with his own hands, protecting his family instead of exploiting them. I pulled my coat tighter against the cold. Nathan, did you ever stop to think what this house means to me? His eyes finally met mine then, and for the first time since all this began, I saw genuine emotion break through his exhaustion. I know it matters, Mom. No, I said softly. You remember it matters. That's different. The truth settled heavily between us, because remembering love and actively honoring it are not the same thing. Behind us, the front door opened suddenly. Tricia stepped outside wearing that same polished expression. Everything okay out here? She asked lightly. Nathan straightened immediately, almost instinctively. And just like that, the moment disappeared. I watched my son retreat emotionally in real time, a grown man shrinking back into silence the second his wife appeared beside him. We're fine, he said quickly. Tricia smiled at me warmly. Gloria, don't worry yourself sick over any of this. We're all on the same team here. I looked directly at her. For the first time, I stopped seeing polished manners and expensive clothes and started seeing desperation underneath them. That changed everything. 3 days later, Tricia invited herself over for lunch. Not Nathan. Just Tricia. That alone told me The conversation had entered a new phase. She arrived carrying a paper bag from a cafe downtown and wearing one of those cream-colored coats that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Her smile appeared the moment I opened the front door. "I brought soup," she said brightly. "I know you've seemed stressed lately." Stressed. Another carefully chosen word. I stepped aside and let her in. The house smelled faintly like cinnamon from the candles I'd lit earlier that morning. Outside, cold November rain drifted against the windows, while Tricia unpacked soup containers onto the kitchen counter as though she belonged there. For a few minutes, she chatted casually about traffic and holiday shopping. Anyone listening would have thought we were two women enjoying a perfectly normal afternoon together. But tension sat beneath every sentence. Finally, after we sat down at the table, Tricia folded her hands neatly in front of her. "There's something Nathan and I wanted to discuss with you." Of course there was. I lifted my spoon calmly. "Go ahead." She inhaled carefully, preparing the performance. "We've been worried about your memory lately." There it was. Not grief, not loneliness. My mind. I set my spoon down without making a sound. "In what way?" "Oh, little things," she replied gently. "Forgetting appointments, repeating stories, misplacing mail. The mail she'd been hiding herself." I almost admired the audacity of it. Tricia tilted her head sympathetically. "It's completely normal at your age, Gloria. At your age." A phrase designed to make protest sound irrational. I stayed quiet. That seemed to encourage her. "We actually spoke with someone who specializes in elder care planning." Spoke with someone. Not considered. Not researched. Spoke. Meaning this had already progressed much further than they admitted. Then Tricia reached into her purse and removed a folder. My stomach tightened immediately. Inside were several forms clipped neatly together. Medical evaluation paperwork. Guardianship information. Power of attorney documents. I recognized enough legal language now to understand exactly what I was looking at. For one brief moment, genuine, hurt, cut through my calm. They weren't simply trying to persuade me anymore. They were building a system around me. A way to slowly remove my control while pretending it was for my own protection. Tricia slid the papers slightly closer across the table. "Nobody's forcing you into anything," she said softly. "We just think it would be smart to start preparing while you're still able to make decisions. Clearly." The cruelty of that sentence almost took my breath away. "While you're still able." As though my mind were already slipping away by the hour. I looked down at the papers again. Then I noticed something else. One signature line had already been highlighted in yellow. Mine. They expected me to sign today. That realization settled heavily inside my chest. Not because I was surprised anymore, but because of how organized this all was. The quiet planning, the rehearsed concern, the careful language meant to make resistance sound unreasonable. I slowly looked back up at Tricia, and for the first time, I stopped seeing her as simply manipulative. I saw someone desperate. Someone who needed this house badly enough to dismantle another person's independence piece by piece. "You've put a lot of thought into this," I said quietly. Relief flickered briefly across her face. "We're only trying to make things easier for everyone. Everyone. Again. Never me specifically. Always everyone else." I leaned back slightly in my chair and let silence stretch between us. People often reveal more when they rush to fill silence. Sure enough, Tricia began talking again. If something happened suddenly, Nathan could face a legal nightmare. Hospitals, probate court, financial complications. She paused carefully. This would protect the family. There it was again. Protection, security, responsibility. All those polished words hiding one ugly truth underneath. Control. My eyes drifted toward the small device sitting beside the recipe books near the kitchen window. My old voice recorder. Frank used to use it for grocery reminders after retirement because he hated typing notes into his phone. This morning before Tricia arrived, I turned it on. Something Arthur said kept echoing in my mind. Be cautious now. So I was. Tricia kept speaking gently while unknowingly recording every word herself. Every suggestion about my mental decline. Every mention of transferring authority. Every subtle attempt to pressure me into surrendering my rights voluntarily. I folded my hands calmly together. Then I asked the question I already knew the answer to. If I sign these papers, would you still want me living here? Tricia hesitated, only for a second, but long enough. Well, she said carefully, eventually assisted living would probably be the safest transition. Transition, such a soft word for removal. Outside, rain continued, tapping steadily against the windows, while the kitchen suddenly felt unbearably quiet. And in that moment, something inside me finally hardened completely. Not rage, not revenge, clarity. Because for weeks, I kept hoping this situation was misunderstanding, grief, stress, or financial panic. But now I understood the truth. They had already decided what my future would be. The only thing left was whether I would quietly cooperate with it. 2 mornings later, Arthur called me. Can you come to my office this afternoon? He asked calmly. Something in his voice told me this wasn't routine. By now, I trusted my instincts enough not to ignore those feelings anymore. Rain clouds hung low over town as I drove downtown again. The windshield wipers moved steadily back and forth, while old memories drifted through my mind. Frank driving this same road with one hand resting casually on the steering wheel. Nathan asleep in the back seat after baseball practice. Simpler years when family still meant safety to me. Arthur's receptionist greeted me quietly when I arrived. But this time, Nathan and Tricia were already there. The moment I stepped into the conference room, both of them stood abruptly. My stomach tightened. Tricia wore a navy blazer and pearl earrings, dressed less like a daughter-in-law and more like someone attending a business negotiation. Nathan looked pale and exhausted. Arthur motioned gently toward the empty chair beside him. Please sit, Gloria. The room smelled faintly like coffee and printer paper. Outside the window, downtown traffic moved normally, while my family prepared to dismantle itself quietly around a polished wooden table. For a few moments, nobody spoke. Then Tricia folded her hands carefully. We thought it would be best to have everyone together, she began softly. Best for whom, I wondered. Arthur remained expressionless beside me. Nathan cleared his throat nervously. Mom, we're worried this situation is becoming too stressful for you. Stressful. Interesting how people create pain and then blame your reaction to it. Tricia slid a folder slowly across the table. We spoke with a care coordinator at Willow Creek, she explained. There's currently an opening available, but we'd need to move quickly. Move quickly. Of course, pressure always depends on urgency. I glanced down at the folder without opening it. This seems very organized. Tricia smiled tightly. We're trying to avoid confusion later. Arthur finally spoke for the first time. Confusion regarding what exactly? Something flickered across Tricia's face. Not fear yet. Just irritation at being interrupted. Nathan and I feel Gloria needs more support than she admits, she replied smoothly. And honestly, managing a property this large alone isn't realistic anymore. Arthur nodded slowly as though considering her words carefully. Then he asked the question she clearly wasn't expecting. Have either of you reviewed the Hensley trust documents? The room went still. Nathan frowned slightly. That answer alone told Arthur everything. Tricia recovered first. Frank never mentioned a trust. No, Arthur replied calmly. He wouldn't have. Then he opened a thick folder in front of him. I watched Tricia's posture change almost immediately. Small shifts, tighter shoulders, less confidence around the eyes. Predators always look different the moment they realize the situation may not be under their control anymore. Arthur adjusted his glasses. 6 months before his death, Frank Hensley placed the property into an irrevocable family trust. Nathan blinked in confusion. Tricia's face lost color slowly. Arthur continued calmly. The house cannot be sold, transferred, leveraged, or reassigned without Mrs. Hensley's direct authorization, alongside independent legal review, confirming she is acting without coercion. Coercion. The word landed heavily in the room. Nathan turned toward Tricia immediately. What does that mean? Arthur's voice remained measured. It means any documented pressure regarding property transfer or competency manipulations would become legally significant. Silence crashed across the room. I could actually hear the ticking clock on the wall behind us now. Tricia straightened slightly.
Nobody is coercing Gloria.
Arthur looked at her steadily. Mrs. Hensley recorded your recent conversation regarding guardianship paperwork. Nathan's head snapped toward me so quickly, it startled even him. You recorded her. His voice sounded wounded, not ashamed. Wounded, as though my self-protection somehow betrayed him. I met his eyes calmly. You were preparing paperwork to declare me mentally unfit. Nathan looked toward Tricia immediately. And there it was, the moment the cracks finally became visible. Tricia spoke quickly now, losing some of her polished tone for the first time. That's not what this is about. We were trying to protect the family financially. She stopped abruptly. Too late, financially. Not emotionally. Not medically. Financially. The truth finally slipped out into open air. Nathan stared at her slowly. Arthur closed the folder quietly. I strongly recommend everyone proceed very carefully from this point forward. The room felt colder now. Smaller somehow. Years ago, family arguments ended with slammed doors and raised voices. But this felt different. This was the quiet collapse of trust itself. Nathan rubbed both hands over his face before finally whispering the question that should have been asked weeks ago. Tricia, how far were we actually planning to take this? She looked at him in disbelief. As far as we needed to. And just like that, the last illusion finally disappeared. Nobody spoke after that. The silence inside Arthur's office felt thick and heavy, like the air itself had changed. Tricia sat perfectly still across the table, but the polished confidence she'd worn for weeks was beginning to crack. Her jaw tautened slightly. One hand gripped the edge of her folder hard enough for her knuckles to pale. Nathan looked like someone waking up slowly from a bad dream. And maybe that's exactly what this was. Not just financial problems, not just debt, but the moment a family crosses the line between struggling together and quietly sacrificing one person to protect everyone else. Arthur finally gathered the paperwork into neat stacks. I believe this meeting is finished, he said calmly. Nobody argued. For once, there was nothing left to manipulate with softer language. No more safety. No more planning ahead. No more pretending this had anything to do with my well-being. Nathan stood first, moving slowly, like his legs suddenly weighed twice as much. Tricia remained seated for another second before following him toward the door. But just before they reached it, Nathan stopped. Then he turned toward me. Mom! His voice cracked slightly. I hadn't heard that tone from him in years. Not since Frank's funeral. I didn't realize things had gotten this far. I studied my son carefully. Part of me wanted to believe him completely. Mothers spend their whole lives searching for pieces of the children they once knew. But another part of me understood something painful now. People don't arrive at betrayal accidentally. They arrive there one compromise at a time. One silence at a time. One moment of choosing comfort over courage. You knew enough, I said quietly. Nathan lowered his eyes immediately. Beside him, Tricia finally lost patience. Oh my God, Nathan, stop acting like I forced you into all of this. Her voice sounded sharper now, less polished, less careful. You agreed with me. Nathan turned toward her slowly. At first, I thought we were helping her. We are helping her, Tricia snapped back. You heard the debt numbers. We're drowning. There it was again. Not grief, not guilt. Need. Pure, desperate need hiding underneath all the manipulation. Arthur remained silent while they argued softly near the doorway. Years of legal work had probably taught him the same thing I was finally learning. Pressure reveals character faster than comfort ever does. Nathan looked exhausted now. We talked about downsizing, he said quietly, not guardianship. Tricia laughed once in disbelief. And what exactly did you think would happen if she refused? The room fell still again. Because Nathan had no answer. Deep down, he already knew. Tricia crossed her arms tightly. We were trying to save our family. I looked at her calmly for a long moment. No, I said softly. You were trying to save your lifestyle. That sentence hit harder than shouting ever could. Tricia's expression hardened immediately. For the first time since I met her 15 years ago, I saw her without the polished manners or carefully rehearsed warmth. Just anger, raw and frightened. You have no idea what pressure we've been under, she whispered. You're right, I replied, because neither of you ever told me the truth. Nathan closed his eyes briefly. That was the tragedy of it all. I would have helped them, if they had come honestly. If they had sat at my kitchen table and admitted they were scared. If my son had trusted me enough to say, Mom, we're in trouble. But instead, they treated me like an obstacle between themselves and financial relief. Arthur finally stood. I think everyone needs some distance, right? Now, Nathan nodded weakly. Tricia grabbed her purse without another word and walked out first, heels striking sharply against the hallway floor. Nathan lingered behind. The boy inside him still wanted to apologize. The man he became still didn't fully know how. I'm sorry, he whispered finally. I believed he meant it. That was what made everything so sad, because remorse after betrayal still leaves damage behind. Nathan spun toward me slightly before stopping himself. Dad would hate me right now. The pain in his voice caught me off guard. For a second, I saw not the grown man drowning in debt, but the 12-year-old boy who once cried for an entire night after accidentally breaking Frank's watch. Frank used to say Nathan felt guilt deeply. Unfortunately, deep guilt doesn't always create strong character. Sometimes it just creates weak people who avoid difficult truths until it's too late. Your father loved you, I said quietly, but he saw more than you realized. Nathan's eyes filled instantly, and suddenly I understood something clearly. Frank prepared for this because he knew me too well. He knew I would always choose forgiveness too quickly. He knew I would mistake silence for peace. That was why he protected the house before he died. Not because he distrusted our son completely, but because he understood how easily fear changes people. Nathan wiped at his eyes once before leaving without another word. After the door closed behind him, the office became quiet again. Arthur looked at me carefully from across the room. How are you holding up? I thought about that question honestly. Then I looked out the window toward the gray Ohio sky and answered with the only truth I had left. I think I finally understand what's been happening to my family. Winter arrived early that year. By mid-November, frost covered the neighborhood each morning, turning the lawn silver beneath the pale Ohio sunrise. The maple tree in my backyard stood nearly bare now, its branches swaying softly outside the kitchen window. While I brewed coffee in the quiet house, Frank and I built together. For the first time in months, the silence no longer frightened me. It felt honest. Nathan and Tricia separated 2 weeks after the meeting at Arthur's office. Not dramatically. No screaming matches, no police cars, no scenes on the front lawn. Just quiet collapse. The kind that happens when pressure finally strips away every excuse. 2 people have been hiding behind. Apparently, the debt was worse than Nathan admitted. Much worse. Credit cards, personal loans, missed mortgage payments. Trisha had spent years building a version of success neither of them could actually afford. And when everything began falling apart, my house became the easiest solution. Not because they hated me. Because desperation slowly taught them to value survival more than integrity. That realization took longer to accept than the betrayal itself. Avery visited often after that. Sometimes she came by after school and sat with me in the kitchen while I baked cornbread or sorted old photographs. Other times, we simply watched old movies together without speaking much at all. One snowy afternoon, she helped me untangle Christmas lights in the garage. "Mom's staying with Aunt Kelly for now," she said quietly while handing me a tangled strand of lights. I nodded gently. Avery hesitated before asking the question that had clearly been sitting inside her for weeks. "Are you mad at Dad forever?" Children ask hard questions so honestly. I looked out toward the backyard for a moment before answering. "When someone disappoints you deeply," I said softly, "you don't stop loving them overnight." Avery stayed quiet. "But love changes after trust breaks," I continued. "And rebuilding trust takes longer than saying sorry." She nodded slowly, like she understood more than any 18-year-old should have to. Nathan started calling regularly after Trisha moved out. At first, I let the calls go to voicemail. Not to punish him. I simply needed time to hear my own thoughts again, without someone asking me to make things easier for them. That's what I finally realized after all these years. Women like me spend entire lifetimes absorbing discomfort so everyone else can remain comfortable. We smooth over tension, excuse bad behavior, accept less than honesty because we're afraid conflict might damage the family. But science damages families too. Sometimes even more. 3 days before Christmas, Nathan came to the house unexpectedly. Snow covered the front porch steps, while cold wind followed him inside. He looked thinner than before. Tired in a deeper way. Older. For a moment, we simply stood there, facing each other in the living room, while the Christmas tree lights glowed softly beside the window. Then Nathan looked around the house slowly. "I forgot how it smells in here at Christmas," he whispered. "Cinnamon candles, fresh pine, coffee brewing in the kitchen. Home." Emotion tightened unexpectedly inside my chest. Because despite everything, this was still my son. The boy Frank, carried upstairs asleep after long car rides. The teenager who once shoveled every driveway on our street after a blizzard because an elderly neighbor couldn't do it herself. People are rarely only one thing. That's what makes family heartbreak so painful. Nathan sat quietly at the kitchen table for a long time before finally speaking. "I keep thinking about Dad," he admitted. I waited. "He warned me once," Nathan said quietly. "A few years ago. He told me not to let money change the way I treated people." Tears filled his eyes before he looked away. I thought I had more time to fix things. That sentence nearly broke my heart. Because by the time most people realize they're becoming someone they never meant to be, damage has already happened. I reached across the table slowly and rested my hand over his. Not forgiveness, not yet, just humanity. Nathan lowered his head and cried silently for several minutes while snow drifted softly outside the windows. And strangely enough, I think that was the moment healing finally began. Not because everything was fixed, but because the pretend finally stopped. After he left, that night, I turned off the kitchen lights and stood alone for a while beside the living room window. The maple tree Frank planted 30 years ago stood tall against the winter sky, roots buried deep beneath frozen ground, strong enough to survive harsh seasons because it had been cared for properly from the beginning. Families should work the same way. But sometimes people lose themselves chasing comfort, appearances, or fear. And sometimes, growing older teaches you the hardest truth of all. The people who truly love you will never treat your dignity like an inconvenience. I still live in the house. Every morning I drink coffee beside Frank's old chair, while sunlight slowly fills the kitchen. Avery still visits. Nathan still calls. Some wounds heal slowly. Some never fully disappear. But peace returned. The moment I stopped confusing silence with love. Growing old did not make me weak. It simply taught me to recognize who was willing to stand beside me, once life stopped being convenient. Growing older taught me something I wish I had understood sooner. Love without honesty eventually becomes fragile. I spent years mistaking silence for peace and sacrifice for security, believing family would always protect one another simply because we shared the same blood. But real love does not pressure, manipulate, or quietly erase someone's dignity when they become inconvenient. In the end, I learned that protecting yourself is not cruelty. Sometimes it is the only way to preserve the life and self-respect you spent decades building.